Today's book is called Mr. Bear Babysits, and it's written by Debbie Gliori. "It's no use," said Mrs. Bear. "The baby won't go to sleep." Said Mr. Bear. "I can't take her with me to babysit for the grizzly bears," said Mrs. Bear. "She'll keep them all awake." Said Mr. Bear. "So you'll have to babysit instead," said Mrs. Bear. Said Mr. Bear. "What?" Sounds like he wasn't paying much attention to her. Mr. Bear walked through the woods to the grizzly bear's house and knocked on the door. Before he could say, "I've come to babysit," a baby bear was thrust into his arms. "We're late, we're very late," said Mr. and Mrs. Grizzly Bear as they bolted out of the door. There he is, holding a little baby. Mr. Bear felt his arms getting sticky. "You'll have to give the baby a bath," said a small bear who appeared at the end of the hall. Mr. Bear didn't know how to bathe a baby. His wife always took care of that. "You're not very good at that," said Fred, as Mr. Bear drenched himself in the bath water. "That's not the right way to do it," said Ted, as Mr. Bear tried to dry himself and the baby with a bathroom rug. "I don't think you're a real babysitter," said Fuzz, as the baby started to cry. Poor Mr. Bear, he has no idea what he's doing. Mr. Bear didn't know how to stop babies from crying, so he patted the baby's head. "You're not very good at that," said Fred, as Mr. Bear rocked the baby up and down. "That's not the right way to do it," said Ted, as Mr. Bear tried to sing a lullaby. "Twinkle, twinkle, little slug, leaving slime trails on the rug." "I don't think you're a real babysitter," said Fuzz, as the baby went on crying. "Perhaps the baby's hungry," said Mr. Bear, and he headed towards the kitchen. I wonder what kind of food he's going to get for this baby. Fred, Ted, and Fuzz watched Mr. Bear prepare a meal of raw fish. The baby wouldn't eat it. "You're not very good at that," said Fred. Then Mr. Bear offered some acorn mush. The baby spit it out. "Don't you know that babies only eat honey? I'm sure you're not a real babysitter," said Fuzz. So Mr. Bear carefully gave the baby some honey. The baby's eyes began to close. "It's very peaceful now," sighed Mr. Bear, as he settled down into a comfortable chair. "I wonder what the others are doing." Looks like they're getting into some trouble. Bonga, bonga, twang, crash! The baby woke up and began to cry. "We were playing hide and seek," said Fred. "But Fuzz hit the clock," said Ted. "And it wobbled too far," said Fuzz. "Oh no." "That's it!" shouted Mr. Bear. "You are quite good at shouting," said Fred. "Upstairs, bed, now!" roared Mr. Bear. "That's the right way to do it," said Ted. "And not a peep out of any of you, or there will be trouble," boomed Mr. Bear. "You are a real babysitter after all," said Fuzz, and they all ran off and dived into bed. Mr. Bear and the baby went into the bathroom. Mr. Bear washed and brushed the baby perfectly. Mr. Bear and the baby went into the kitchen. Mr. Bear cleaned up the mess, made himself a cup of tea, loaded a plate with cookies, and warmed a little honey, all the while humming a soothing lullaby to keep the baby happy. Seems like he's learning. Then Mr. Bear and the baby sank into the comfy chair in front of the fire, and very soon all was quiet. Mr. Bear was just falling asleep when the grizzly bears returned home. "Don't know how you got that baby to sleep," said Mrs. Grizzly Bear. "I always let my husband take care of that." Mr. Bear smiled a secret smile to himself. Mr. Bear walked home by moonlight past burrows and nests where babies and children were being tucked in and lights were turned low for the night. Mr. Bear's secret smile grew wider. When he reached his house, Mr. Bear could hear his baby crying. Mr. Bear tiptoed inside. "Can I help?" he asked. "Yes, you could hold her for a minute while I make us both a cup of blueberry tea," said Mrs. Bear. Mr. Bear held his baby carefully in his lap and sang her a lullaby. Her cries turned to little hiccupy sobs, and then to hiccups, and finally, with a small burp, she closed her eyes. When Mrs. Bear brought the tea, she found Mr. Bear and his baby fast asleep. Thanks for listening.